The atmospheric processor wheezed like a dying animal, its ancient coils struggling to push breathable air through the abandoned mining station's corridors. Jackson Reed cursed under his breath as another warning light flickered red on his diagnostic tablet. 3 months since the Terran-Viridian War had officially ended, and here he was, crawling through the bowels of Kepler 442b station like some glorified janitor. Should have stayed on Mars, he muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The company had promised him triple pay for this salvage mission, but they'd failed to mention the station's life support was held together with prayer and recycled duct tape. The detention level stretched before him in endless shadows, emergency lighting casting eerie red pools every 20 meters. Most of the cells stood open, their occupants long since transferred or... Well, Jackson tried not to think about the alternatives. The war had ended officially, but cleanup operations were rarely clean. His boots echoed against metal grating as he made his way toward the atmospheric junction box. The sound seemed to disturb something in the darkness ahead, a soft whimper that made him pause mid-step. Jackson frowned, tilting his head to listen. Nothing but the station's mechanical groaning. He was about to continue when he heard it again, a weak, desperate sound that raised the hair on his arms. Following the sound deeper into the detention block, Jackson's flashlight beam swept across empty cells until it caught something that made his blood freeze. In the far corner behind bars that should have been opened months ago, 2 figures huddled together on the cold floor. Jesus Christ, he breathed. The larger figure, clearly female, raised her head with tremendous effort. Even in the dim light, Jackson could see the distinctive features of a Viridian: elongated limbs, skin with a subtle purple hue, and large, intelligent eyes that now stared at him with a mixture of hope and terror. She clutched a small child against her chest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Jackson's hand shook as he approached the cell. The woman was emaciated, her clothes hanging like rags from her skeletal frame. The child wasn't moving. "Hey," Jackson called softly, crouching down to their level. "Hey, can you understand me?" The woman's lips moved, producing sounds in the melodic Viridian language that Jackson's universal translator struggled to parse. But he didn't need translation to understand the desperation in her voice, the way she gestured weakly toward the child. "Water," she managed in broken standard, the word barely a whisper. "Please, water." Jackson fumbled for his emergency rations, his engineering training taking over even as his mind reeled. How long had they been here? How had everyone just forgotten them? The lock on the cell was electronic, but without power, it had defaulted to its failsafe position. Locked. Jackson pulled out his plasma cutter, normally used for salvaging metal components. His hands trembled as he aimed it at the lock mechanism. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring them or himself. "I'm going to get you out of here." The lock sizzled and sparked under the plasma beam. As it finally gave way, Jackson pulled the cell door open with a metallic screech that seemed to echo through the entire station. The woman tried to stand but collapsed immediately. Jackson caught her, feeling how light she'd become, how her body trembled with exhaustion. The child, her son, he assumed, stirred slightly at the movement. "It's going to be okay," Jackson whispered, though part of him wondered if it was already too late. "I've got you now." As he helped them from the cell, the woman looked up at him with those large, luminous eyes. She said something in Viridian, then reached out with one shaking hand to touch his face. Despite everything, the war, the abandonment, the slow starvation, there was gratitude there, and something else that made Jackson's chest tighten unexpectedly. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of patrol boots on metal decking. His rescue had just become significantly more complicated. But looking down at the dying woman and her child, Jackson Reed made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Some things mattered more than salvage contracts and company protocols. Some things mattered more than staying safe. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the detention level like a countdown to disaster. Jackson's mind raced as he cradled the weakened Viridian woman against his chest, her child barely conscious in her arms. He had maybe 2 minutes before the patrol reached this section. "Can you walk?" he whispered urgently. Kes, she had whispered her name between gasps, shook her head weakly. Her legs couldn't support her weight after months of captivity. Jackson made a quick decision, scooping up the child with one arm while supporting Kes with the other. Service tunnel, he muttered to himself, remembering the station schematics he'd studied before arrival. 20 meters down the corridor, hidden behind a maintenance panel, lay their only chance. Each step felt like an eternity. Kes tried to help, her bare feet sliding on the cold metal floor, but she was little more than dead weight. The child, Torin, she'd called him, stirred in Jackson's arms, large violet eyes opening to stare at this strange human who smelled of machine oil and determination. The maintenance panel yielded to Jackson's electronic keycard with a soft hiss. Behind it, a narrow service tunnel stretched into darkness, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It wasn't designed for carrying passengers, but it would have to do. "This is going to be uncomfortable," Jackson warned, though he doubted Kes understood. Her universal translator had been confiscated along with everything else. He went first, pulling them both through the cramped space. Kes bit back cries of pain as the rough tunnel walls scraped against her malnourished body. Behind them, the patrol's voices grew louder, more urgent. Someone had noticed the burned lock. The tunnel seemed endless, stretching through the station's mechanical heart. Steam pipes hissed overhead, and electrical conduits sparked occasionally, casting brief shadows on the walls. Kes's breathing became more labored with each meter they traveled. Finally, the tunnel opened into a larger maintenance bay near the station's docking ring. Jackson's ship, the Catalyst, waited in berth 7, a small cargo hauler that looked more rust than metal, but had gotten him across half the galaxy. "Almost there," he whispered, though Kes had lost consciousness again. Torin watched everything with those unnaturally large eyes, taking in details with the intensity only children possessed. The docking bay was mercifully empty. Jackson's security code still worked, and the Catalyst's airlock cycled open with a familiar wheeze. He carried his unexpected passengers to the small medical bay, little more than a first aid station, but it had clean water and basic supplies. Kes came to as well. He placed her on the narrow medical cot. Her eyes found his immediately, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Despite her weakened state, despite the language barrier, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "Water," she whispered again, the same word that had broken his heart in the detention cell. Jackson held a cup to her lips, supporting her head as she drank. She was beautiful, he realized with surprise. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, her features held an elegant grace that spoke of noble birth. Her skin, where it wasn't bruised, had the subtle purple hue of evening sky. Torin accepted water more eagerly, his small hands wrapping around the cup with desperate strength. He spoke to his mother in rapid Viridian, gesturing toward Jackson with obvious questions. "Jackson," the human said, pointing to himself. "Jackson." "Jackson," Kes repeated carefully, her accent turning the simple name into something almost musical. She touched her chest. "Kes." Then, indicating her son, "Torin." The ship's proximity alarms suddenly screamed to life. Through the small porthole, Jackson could see security vehicles racing across the docking bay toward their berth. Someone had traced their route through the maintenance tunnels. "Hold on," Jackson commanded, rushing to the pilot's seat. The Catalyst wasn't built for speed, but she was reliable. Her engines fired with a stuttering roar that made the entire ship vibrate. Through the comms, angry voices demanded his immediate surrender. Station security was ordering him to cut engines and prepare for boarding. Instead, Jackson pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar lurch as they broke free of the station's docking clamps. Kes had struggled to the medical bay doorway, clutching the frame for support. She watched the stars wheel past the porthole as they accelerated away from Kepler 442b, and for the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It was a weak smile, barely more than a softening of her features, but it transformed her face completely. Jackson felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the ship's heating systems. "Thank you," she said in careful, standard, the words heavily accented but unmistakable. Behind them, the abandoned mining station grew smaller, its lights fading into the stellar background. They were free, but Jackson knew this was only the beginning. He'd just made himself a fugitive from human authority to save two aliens he barely knew. Looking at Kes as she held her son close, watching the stars with wonder rather than despair, Jackson decided it was the best decision he'd ever made. The ship's navigation computer chimed, requesting their destination. Jackson stared at the star charts, realizing he had no idea where they were going. All he knew was that they were going there together. In the medical bay, Kes began to sing, softly to Torin, a Viridian lullaby that sounded like wind through silver chimes. The sound filled the small ship with something Jackson hadn't felt in years: hope. 2 days into their journey toward Haven Station, Kes had regained enough strength to move around the Catalyst's cramped quarters without help. Jackson found himself stealing glances at her as she explored his ship with careful curiosity, her fingers trailing along surfaces with the delicate touch of someone rediscovering the world. The language barrier had become less of an obstacle than he'd expected. Kes was remarkably intelligent, picking up standard words with startling speed. More importantly, they developed a form of communication that transcended words, gestures, expressions, and shared moments of understanding that felt almost intimate. "Torin likes your ship," Kes said one evening, her accent making the words sound like music. She sat beside Jackson in the cockpit, close enough that he could smell the subtle floral scent of her hair after her first real shower in months. The boy was currently asleep in the small passenger bunk, exhausted from a day of exploring every accessible system on the ship. His natural curiosity had returned as his strength grew, and Jackson found himself enjoying the child's endless questions, even when they came in rapid Viridian. "He's a smart kid," Jackson replied, checking their navigation display. "Reminds me of myself at that age, always taking things apart to see how they worked." Kes smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. Over the past days, Jackson had learned to read the subtle changes in her expression, the way her luminous eyes conveyed emotions her limited standard vocabulary couldn't express. "You are good man," she said carefully. Then frustration crossed her features as she struggled for more complex words. Without thinking, Jackson reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to say anything." The touch sent an unexpected jolt through both of them. Kes's skin was softer than human skin, slightly cooler to the touch, but the connection felt electric. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars streak past. It was then that she began to draw. Using Jackson's tablet, Kes created intricate diagrams that gradually told a story. Her artistic skill was remarkable, each line precise and meaningful. The images showed Viridian cities before the war, soaring spires that seemed to grow from the earth itself, integrated with nature in ways human architecture never achieved. Then came darker images, burning cities, fleeing civilians, and finally, a laboratory where Viridian scientists worked frantically on something important. "Torin," she said, pointing to the final image. It showed DNA helixes, genetic markers, and complex biological processes that were beyond Jackson's understanding but clearly significant. "He's special," Jackson realized, looking toward the sleeping child. Kes nodded gravely, then drew more images. Viridian adults, but their features were subtly wrong, older, more fragile, fewer children among them. The war had done more than destroy their cities. It had damaged something fundamental about their ability to reproduce. "Biological warfare," Jackson breathed, the pieces clicking together. "They targeted your fertility rates." "Torin, hope," Kes said simply, but her eyes conveyed the weight of an entire species' survival resting on her small son's shoulders. That night, as the ship's systems hummed around them, Jackson found Kes standing at the observation port in the common area. She wore one of his spare shirts, comically oversized on her slender frame, and her hair fell in dark waves around her shoulders. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. She turned, and in the starlight, her skin seemed to shimmer with its own inner glow. "I dream of the cage," she admitted. "I wake, and for a moment I think—" "You're safe now," Jackson said, moving closer. "I won't let anything happen to you or Torin." "Why?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. "Why risk everything for strangers?" Jackson considered the question seriously. Why had he thrown away his comfortable life to save two aliens he'd never met? The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. "Because it was right," he said. "Because you needed help and I could give it. Because—" He hesitated, then forged ahead. "Because the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you." Kes stepped closer, close enough that he could see the complex patterns of silver that traced through her violet irises like captured starlight. "In Viridian culture," she said softly, "we believe souls call to each other across the void. When two souls recognize each other, distance and difference mean nothing." Her hand found his chest, resting over his heart. The touch was gentle but sent fire through his veins. "I feel your soul calling, Jackson Reed." When their lips met, it was with the inevitability of gravity. Despite their differences, human and Viridian, the barriers of language and culture, the kiss felt like coming home. Her lips were softer than human lips, slightly cooler, but they warmed under his touch. They broke apart slowly, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. "This is complicated," Jackson whispered. "Life is complicated," Kes replied, her improved standard making the words clear. "But this feels simple." That night, they lay together in Jackson's quarters, not as lovers yet, but as two souls finding comfort in each other's presence. Kes curled against his side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his human heart. "Tomorrow we reach Haven Station," Jackson said into the darkness. "Tomorrow," Kes agreed, but her tone suggested she understood what that meant. Decisions would have to be made, paths chosen, and their fragile bubble of peace might burst. For now, though, they had the night, the stars, and each other. Grew. The vast loneliness of space that felt like everything. In the passenger bunk, Torin slept peacefully, unaware that his genetic legacy carried the hopes of an entire species, or that the human who'd rescued them was falling in love with his mother. Haven Station lived up to its name, a sprawling commercial hub built into a massive asteroid, where species from across the galaxy came to trade, hide, or start over. Its neutral status made it the perfect refuge for three fugitives, but as the catalyst docked in the station's outer ring, Jackson felt the weight of approaching decisions. Kes had grown stronger during their week-long journey, her natural grace returning along with her health. She moved through the ship with fluid elegance, and Jackson found himself mesmerized by simple things. The way she prepared their meals with careful attention to presentation, how she sang Viridian songs while braiding her hair, the gentle patience she showed when teaching Torin basic standard words. Their relationship had deepened beyond the desperate gratitude of rescue. In the intimate confines of his ship, they'd shared stories, dreams, and increasingly passionate embraces that left them both aching for more. "Welcome to Haven," Jackson said as they walked through the station's main promenade. The diversity was staggering, dozens of species mingling in the vast commercial space, their various languages creating a symphony of galactic civilization. Torin pressed close to his mother, overwhelmed by the crowds after months of isolation. But his eyes were bright with curiosity, taking in everything from the floating transport pods to the exotic vendors selling goods from across known space. They found lodging in the station's residential sector, a small suite with separate bedrooms and a common area. It felt luxurious after the cramped confines of the ship, but also strangely empty. The forced proximity that had brought them together was gone, replaced by the awkward dance of new lovers trying to define their relationship. That evening, after Torin had fallen asleep, Kes and Jackson sat together on the small balcony overlooking the station's central plaza. The artificial sky above showed a slowly cycling display of different worlds' sunsets, a reminder of the vast galaxy beyond their temporary sanctuary. "I need to tell you something," Kess said, her standard now fluent, enough for complex conversation. "About Torin, about what he carries." Jackson took her hand, thumb tracing across her knuckles. "I know he's important to your people." "More than important," she whispered. "He may be our only hope." She explained in greater detail what she'd only hinted at through drawings. The Terran forces had deployed a targeted biological weapon during the war's final phase, a virus that attacked Viridian reproductive cells. It was designed to win through attrition, gradually reducing birth rates over generations until the species simply faded away. Torin was born after the initial deployment, Kess continued. His father was a geneticist who had been working on immunity factors. Before he died in the bombing of our research facility, he managed to alter Torin's genetic structure. He carries immunity markers that could be used to develop treatments for our entire species. That's why they kept you alive, Jackson realized. They knew. Kess nodded. We were to be transferred to a research facility. When the war ended, we were forgotten, left to die slowly while more important matters took precedence. The weight of it settled between them. Torin wasn't just Kess's son. He was potentially the savior of an entire species, and they'd been rotting in a cage while bureaucrats processed paperwork. Their intimate moment was interrupted by a commotion in the plaza below. A sleek Viridian ship had landed, its elegant lines distinctly different from human vessels. Figures, in military dress uniforms, were disembarking, their movements purposeful and urgent. "Commander Vex?" Kess breathed, recognizing one of the figures. "They found us." Within an hour, their door chimed with visitors. Jackson opened it to find 3 Viridians in formal attire, their bearing unmistakably military despite their diplomatic smiles. Commander Vex was an imposing figure, tall even by Viridian standards, with silver streaking through his dark hair and eyes that held the weight of command. His companions flanked him with the practiced ease of bodyguards. "Kess," he said formally, inclining his head. "It brings me joy to see you alive and well." The conversation that followed was conducted in Viridian, with Kess translating key points for Jackson. The commander was polite but firm. Kess and Torin were needed on New Viridia, the colony world where the species' survivors had gathered. Scientists, they were ready to study Torin's unique genetics and develop the treatments their people desperately needed. "And if we refuse?" Kess asked. Vex's expression grew grave. "Then our species dies slowly. Already birth rates have dropped by 70%. In 2 generations there may be no more Viridians in the galaxy." The moral weight was crushing. How could they deny an entire species the chance for survival? But Jackson saw the fear in Kess's eyes, the way she held Torin protectively close. "What about her choice?" Jackson interjected. "What about Torin's childhood? His right to be more than just a genetic resource?" Commander Vex studied him with interest. "You are the human who rescued them, yes? Your actions have not gone unnoticed. Perhaps there is a place for you in this as well." That night, after the Viridians had left them to consider their options, Jackson and Kess made love with the desperate passion of those facing separation. In the privacy of their quarters, with Torin sleeping peacefully in the next room, they explored each other with gentle intensity. Kess's skin was silk beneath his hands, her responses to his touch uniquely Viridian, yet universally feminine. When she moved above him, her dark hair falling like a curtain around them, Jackson felt complete in a way he'd never experienced. "I love you," he whispered against her throat, tasting the subtle sweetness of her skin. "And I love you," she replied, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Which is why this is so difficult." Later, as they lay entwined, Kess traced patterns on Jackson's chest with her fingertips. On New Viridia, Torin would be honored, protected, given everything he could want. But he would also be isolated, studied, treated as precious cargo rather than a child. And here, he could be normal. We could be a family, But my people would die, Jackson finished softly. The choice hung between them like a blade. Personal happiness versus species survival. Love versus duty. The warm sanctuary of Haven Station suddenly felt cold and temporary. There might be another way, Jackson said eventually. What if we don't have to choose between love and duty? What if there's a path that serves both? Kess looked up at him, hope flickering in her luminous eyes. What do you mean? Tomorrow I'm going to make Commander Vex an offer he can't refuse. In the artificial dawn of Haven Station's day cycle, their future remained uncertain. But for the first time since the Viridians had arrived, Kess smiled with genuine hope. Sometimes the best solutions came from refusing to accept that there were only two choices. The meeting took place in Haven Station's diplomatic quarter, in a neutral conference room with windows overlooking the vast, stellar nursery that served as the system's backdrop. Commander Vex sat across from Jackson and Kess, his expression skeptical, but attentive. Let me understand your proposal, Vex said carefully. You wish to accompany Kess and Torin to New Viridia, not as a refugee or dependent, but as an official human liaison. Jackson nodded. The war is over, but the peace is fragile. Both our species need to learn to coexist. What better way to start than with a human engineer helping to rebuild Viridian infrastructure? And the child? Torin gets to be a child. Kess interjected firmly. He helps our people, yes, but he also goes to school, makes friends, has a normal life. His genetic material can be studied, treatments developed, but he is not a prisoner of his own importance. Commander Vex was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. This arrangement would be unprecedented. So was abandoning prisoners, of war to die in forgotten cells, Jackson replied evenly. Sometimes unprecedented situations require unprecedented solutions. The negotiations took 3 days. In the end, it was Torin himself who sealed the agreement. When Vex visited their quarters to deliver the final terms, the boy approached him with the fearless curiosity of childhood and began asking questions in rapid Viridian about the commander's uniform, his ship, and whether New Viridia had good places to climb trees. Watching this innocent interaction, seeing the hope it kindled in the hardened military commander's eyes, made the decision obvious. 6 months later, Jackson stood in the garden of their home on New Viridia, watching Torin play with a group of Viridian children, while Kess tended to the flowering vines that grew along their porch. The integration hadn't been without challenges, but it had worked better than anyone expected. The colony world was beautiful, a carefully balanced ecosystem where Viridian biotechnology worked in harmony with natural processes. Cities grew, rather than were built, their organic architecture blending seamlessly with forests and rivers. It was like living inside a work of art. Jackson's engineering expertise had proven invaluable in adapting human technology to work with Viridian biosystems. More importantly, his presence had opened doors for other human-Viridian collaborations. The first cultural exchange programs were already being planned, and there was talk of joint research initiatives. The treatments are working, Kess said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of tea. The first generation of children born with the immunity factors will arrive next month. Torin's legacy, Jackson mused, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Our legacy, she corrected, taking his hand. None of this would have happened without you. The ceremony that evening was unlike anything in human or Viridian tradition, because it belonged to both cultures simultaneously. In the grove behind their home, surrounded by friends from 2 species, Jackson and Kess exchanged vows that had been crafted to honor both their backgrounds. Captain Torres, the human trader who had helped them at Haven Station, served as Jackson's witness. Commander Vex, now a close friend rather than a stern military figure, performed the Viridian portions of the ceremony. Torin, dressed in formal clothes but with dirt still under his fingernails from afternoon adventures, carried their wedding rings with solemn pride. In human tradition, Jackson said, looking into Kess's luminous eyes, I promise to love, honor, and protect you for all the days of my life. In Viridian tradition, Kess replied, her voice clear and strong. I bind my soul to yours across all the spaces between stars, in this life and whatever may come after. When they kissed, sealing their union, the Viridian guest began a harmony that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Human voices joined in, creating something entirely new, a song that belonged to neither species alone but to the future they were building together. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Jackson and Kess found themselves alone for a moment in the garden. The larger moon of New Viridia cast silver light through the flowering trees, and in the distance they could hear Torin's laughter as he ran through the grove with his new friends. Do you ever regret it? Kess asked softly. Giving up your old life for this uncertainty? Jackson considered the question seriously. His previous existence seemed like a lifetime ago. The lonely cargo runs, the empty apartment on Mars, the routine that had masqueraded as purpose. That man had been surviving. This man was living. Never, he said finally. The day I found you in that cage, my real life began. Kess smiled, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. Mine too. In the years that followed, their story became something of a legend on both worlds. The human engineer who had risked everything to save two strangers. The Viridian woman whose love had bridged species. The child whose genetics had saved his people, and whose laughter had proved that hope could flourish even in the darkest places. Torin grew up bilingual, bicultural, and completely comfortable moving between human and Viridian communities. He became a scientist like his biological father, but also an artist like his mother and an engineer like Jackson. Most importantly, he grew up free, not as a genetic resource or a symbol, but as a beloved child with the entire galaxy as his playground. The Viridian birth rate stabilized and began to climb. The first mixed human Viridian settlements were established. Trade agreements became cultural exchanges, which became lasting friendships, which became the foundation for something unprecedented in galactic history, true interspecies cooperation. And it all began with one human who heard crying in the dark and chose to help. Standing in their garden 20 years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren of both species, Jackson Reed realized that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could reshape the galaxy. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to prove that in the vast darkness of space, humanity, in all its forms, still mattered. The cage was empty now. The prisoners were free. And love, as it always did, had found a way.